That message always gets me as soon as I start talking. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin, as usual, with our land acknowledgement, reminding us that Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. And now I'm very delighted to present our very own Dr. Amy Robinson, our presenter for Grand Rounds this morning. Amy received her medical degree from Queen's University and then, of course, completed her core pediatric residency training here at the University of Ottawa. She went on to complete a clinical fellowship in adolescent medicine at the Montreal Children's Hospital. Dr. Robinson joined CHEO in 2014 as a clinician and medical teacher in the Division of Adolescent Health in the Department of Pediatrics and as an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine, University of Ottawa. She also serves as the wellness lead for the Pediatric Residency Program and clearly has taken on this role with incredible drive and enthusiasm to promote wellness among our residents. Amy's clinical interests are many, including sexual health and contraception, vulnerable and high-risk youth, and pediatric eating disorders. She's a clinician investigator with the CHEO-RI, presenting at national and international clinical meetings on her research interests, which include active projects in medical education, fatigue risk management, physician wellness, and hospital care of vulnerable youth. Dr. Robinson currently serves as the president of the Canadian Pediatric Society Adolescent Health Section and acts as a liaison member to the Adolescent Health Committee. And this morning, she's going to present to us with that very compelling picture on her title slide, From Surviving to Thriving, Fatigue Risk Management in Residency. Over to you, Amy.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mona, and thank you for having me today. Yes, today we're going to talk about fatigue in residency and hopefully go from just surviving to thriving, like maybe Alex pictured here is. So today we're going to talk about the role of fatigue as an occupational risk in medical education, with risks to the learner, workplace, and of course, patient safety, and also discuss how everyone at all levels of medical education have a role in mitigating this risk, and also reflect on some local opportunities and some fatigue risk strategies that we may actually already be doing in the clinical learning environment. So what's the deal with fatigue? And more like, why is Amy always talking about it? So just to set the stage and why we're talking about this, particularly here and today, is in the before times, as I like to call them, or a few years ago, our pediatrics residency program was successful in obtaining a grant, a fatigue risk management grant from the Royal College. That was, the purpose of this was to select one of two sites, pilot sites, to mitigate the risks associated with fatigue risk in the clinical learning environment by implementing a fatigue risk management plan. And then doing this and then telling everyone how it went and what we learned. So cue kind of the last, I think now it's been 3 years of really going down this fatigue rabbit hole and getting all wrapped up in everything fatigue related. And we're kind of coming out the other side of it now. And I'm going to take you down the rabbit hole a little bit with me today. Really no talk would be complete without some history of medicine in it, or maybe a Norman Rockwell painting. But when we talk about the history of the resident, which I always found super interesting, our first kind of medical education program started in the 1820s in Montreal. And after graduating from medical school, we had kind of two choices. Either you went straight into medical practice, like this dapper gentleman here, or you actually took on a house officer position, which were kind of house surgeons or physicians that were hired to live in the hospital and provide patient care services around the clock. A lot of graduates took at least kind of a year of one of these house officer positions, really to kind of gain more experience before they entered their own practice. So really the term residents evolved because these residents actually resided at the hospital. I see Dr. Reisman joined us, and if anyone remembers the great Dr. McCluskey and sitting through a monologue on his experience in the UK during his training, and just living in the hospital and living the dream, really. So residency programs themselves. So the Royal College started up shortly in the 1920s in response to kind of some concerns about specialty training. First started kind of their accreditation in the 40s, and it was really more hospital focused because again, these residents were hospital workers, and whether or not the hospitals had enough access to go back on Epic, had enough kind of patient population or a variety of patient population, and led to the creation actually of clinical teaching units. And they kind of did the first kind of on-site accreditation survey in London, Ontario. That was the first time they actually used the word program on assessing residency. And in the 60s, the first kind of resident unions came up. Also because until the 1950s, really as an employee of the hospital, they received room and board and a small stipend for compensation. And as kind of expectations and demands grew and people actually wanted to maybe live outside the hospital and have families, there was, I guess, advocacy to do so. And it wasn't until actually 1975 that the Royal College transferred the, I guess, management of residency programs from the hospitals to the universities. So really, I always find it very interesting, kind of in reflecting, and also around that, service versus education debate, or the dual role the resident plays, given that they actually started off as hospital workers and then kind of evolved into the education, into being educated or focus on education. And then the Royal College really continued, and now we have the beast that accreditation is today, including these new kind of general standards of accreditation for residency programs. And obviously, especially in Canada, everyone wants their residency program to be accredited, because without an accredited program, you have no residence. And I was going to take a picture of myself looking sad, but obviously none of us could even think of a hospital without residents. So back to fatigue. So when we talk about fatigue management, I didn't just invent fatigue. It's been around for a while, especially when people were working very elongated shifts. But the focus specifically on resident fatigue and their conditions and hours of work really happened in the late 20th century, kind of early 2000s. And that was mainly one of the main, I guess, starting off points was this case, Libby Zion's case that happened in New York. So Libby Zion was an 18-year-old female in New York who was admitted overnight with flu-like symptoms. Her parents brought her in and then kind of were sent home afterwards. And she actually died 12 hours later. It really got to the attention of the kind of media and really world because her father was a lawyer and a New York Times writer. And he really kind of opened the hell gates to kind of find out why this happened to his daughter. And he was really convinced his daughter's death was due to inadequate staffing at the teaching hospitals. Cue kind of multiple state investigations, actually a civil trial. And I mean, despite there definitely being some issues with the clinical environment, including being admitted to a PGY1 and a PGY2 who were already into their 20 plus hour of work going into a night shift. Actually, in retrospect, she likely died of serotonin syndrome because being agitated, they actually gave her Demerol, which interacted with her prescribed antidepressant Nardil. But no one really wasn't as familiar at the time, serotonin syndrome. And as her temperature rose, they continued to give her more sedating medications, unfortunately. And she died of cardiac arrest with I think her temperature was 107 Fahrenheit at the time. But yeah, Dad was not happy, and neither should anyone have been. But again, lots of investigations afterwards, including the New York State's Bell Commission report, which really drew attention to resident duty hours and working conditions. And at first in New York State, and then afterwards kind of adopted by the accrediting body in the US, they kind of put in some resident duty hour limits. So limit of 80 hours per week, which again is still 2 full-time jobs, limiting your shift length to 24 continuous hours, although there was some handover and kind of continuity of care exceptions, and then in-house call 1 and 3, as well as in this case, the PGY1 and PGY2 were alone in the hospital, responsible for 40 plus patients in the emerge, where the kind of staff was at home. So they also said that the attending physicians need to be physically present in the hospital. And a similar, actually even more restrictive duty hour, I guess amendments or restrictions were in Europe at the time. And we'll kind of go from there. So back to fatigue again. I keep on doing these little kind of segues, but what is fatigue? It's probably one of those things that you don't really need to describe, but it's really that subjective feeling of tiredness that's experienced kind of both physically and mentally. It can, range from exhaustion to unrelenting kind of overall condition, and it interferes usually with your ability to function in a normal capacity. And again, as I mentioned, there's both physical as well as psychological symptoms. And again, the nice thing kind of in our talk, we know that it's not just kind of sleep or hours, but there's so many different things that are causes of fatigue. We'll talk a little bit about sleep, given that that's a kind of big contributor. And the process of kind of sleep regulation is really twofold. First, there's the circadian rhythm, which is really this 24-hour biological clock that 24 to 25 hours, and everyone has, that really makes you feel awake during the day and asleep at night. And no matter what, kind of acting against this circadian system feels like jet lag. And then there's the homeostatic drive or the sleep drive. So circadian rhythm is sleep independent, but homeostatic drive is sleep dependent. So the longer you're awake, the sleepier you'll eventually become. Really kind of both for both processes, if you've been awake all day, especially for circadian rhythm, there's the effects are most apparent in the later half of the night. I don't think I have to tell anyone who's ever worked shifts or been on call that that kind of 3 to 5 witching hour is definitely a high risk time for being fatigued and possibly related impairments. So I'll let this cool Blackboard video tell us a little bit more.
Tired? We all know the feeling. Irritable, groggy, and exceptionally lazy. Chances are you didn't sleep enough last night, or the past few nights. But what exactly is enough sleep? And more importantly, can you ever catch up on it? While the very function of sleep is still debated by scientists, we do know that it's necessary to function efficiently and productively. After all, we spend 24 years of our lifetime sleeping, it'd better be important. Researchers have tested how much is required each night by assigning groups of people to 4, 6, and 8 hours of sleep over extended periods of time. After 14 days, those with 8 hours of sleep exhibited few attention lapses or cognitive issues. However, those with 6 or 4 hours of sleep showed a steady decline. In fact, after only 2 weeks, the 6-hour group showed a similar reaction time to a person with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1%, which is considered legally drunk. The 4-hour sleepers suffered even more, occasionally falling asleep during their cognitive tests. In both groups, brain function decreased day by day almost linearly with no sign of leveling off. Scientists have dubbed this cumulative effect as sleep debt. So can we recover from it? After a night or two of little sleep, studies show that the body and brain can fully recover with a few nights of good sleep. However, with long-term sleep deprivation on the scale of weeks to months, the recovery of cognitive function is much slower, requiring many more nights of quality sleep. On the timescale of months to years, it's unknown whether brain function can be fully repaired or if it causes permanent damage. Paradoxically, with chronic sleep deprivation, your sleepiness or how tired you feel does eventually level off, meaning that you become less and less aware of your objective impairment over time. So how long should you sleep? Most studies tend to show that 7 to 8 hours of sleep is the average ideal for humans. Apart from the cognitive issues, individuals who consistently sleep less than 7 hours a night have an increased risk of heart disease, obesity, and diabetes, not to mention a 12% higher risk of death. On the flip side, studies have shown that while sleeping more than 8 hours does not impair brain function, it also carries an increased risk of heart disease, obesity, and diabetes, and a 30% increased risk of mortality. So too much sleep may also be a bad thing. But variation most certainly exists, and our genetics play a large role. In fact, individuals genuinely unaffected by only 6 hours of sleep were found to have a mutation of a specific gene. When scientists genetically engineered mice to express this gene, they were able to stay awake for an extra 1.2 hours than normal mice. It turns out these short sleepers have more biologically intense sleep sessions than the average person. Ultimately, while it's important to know the ideal average of 7 to 8 hours exists, let your body and brain help you figure out its own needs. After all, no one shoe size fits all. If you want to know
I usually forget to kind of give a trigger warning for any of us who may experience kind of chronic sleep deprivation, especially when they take a chunk out of the guy's brain. Specifically for kind of causes of fatigue within the kind of training environment, we talked about sleep, circadian rhythms, amount and quality of sleep. But one of the things that it was important to notice that there in this slide, this is specific to kind of residents, is that there's things within the individual's control, but then things not. And especially kind of residents who may not have as much control over their schedules as some of us. Some of these things will actually, affect your ability to get enough sleep, whether it's through actual work hours or kind of inadequate rest between shifts. And when we go on to talk about why that's important and the effects of fatigue, probably don't have to go into too much detail, especially for people who are maybe currently residents, who have previously been a resident or done night work, or any parents in the room or anyone who's done childcare. I didn't just have a baby, that's my niece, but that's after 5 days of looking after her. But the consequences of fatigue can be vast. And I like this slide as well, because it's not just to the individual, but especially within the context of medical care and patient care. It's not just personal, but also colleagues and patients, family and friends and strained relationships, as well as even the risk of driving while fatigued and other road users. This is from kind of Transportation Canada, a nice little visual for us, but Professor Drew Dawson, who's one of the fatigue expert that we work with on the Royal College project. This is actually, he was one of the first to do this study, and he took he recruited medical students, and he took half of them and got them drunk, and the other half and sleep deprived them. He said it was the easiest study that he's ever had to recruit for. But in kind of a sleep lab doing different performance testing, it showed that even just after 21 hours, that their performance was similar, someone who's been sleep deprived to someone who's legally drunk, actually, 8% or 0.08 being the limit in Ontario. And obviously it gets worse with time. So more kind of specific consequences in the clinical training environment, things that kind of set up or make people sit up and pay attention, obviously, are patient care and that, or patient safety. And that gives a lot of weight to the arguments that fatigue risk should be addressed. I'll just highlight a couple of kind of key studies over the years. This is out of the group at Harvard, but comparing residents who worked recurrent 24-hour shifts versus limited to 16-hour shifts, still a pretty long time, and especially at night, there was a much increased rate of serious medical errors, diagnostic errors, that's attentional failures, et cetera. And actually there was 300% more fatigue-related adverse events that resulted in a patient fatality in those that worked the kind of longer shifts. And it's known that your fatigue-related error risk increases after just 8 hours of duty and actually doubles after 12 hours. We talk about resident well-being as well, and here kind of occupational health. Definitely the longer you're awake after the 20th hour here, there's more needle stick and sharp injuries, and you actually have double the risk of being in a motor vehicle accident after driving home after 24 hours of work. Not only, I think, any of us who've been fatigued and pretty cranky, there's noted effects on the mood, difficulty starting and maintaining relationships, and also being effective parents. I didn't mention it here, but also just risk to professionalism, both kind of your interactions with patients as well as colleagues, fatigue. People who are increased excessive fatigue show less empathy. And a recent study released from the CMPA that reviewed college complaints against residents noted that the two most consistent, I guess, factors or problems with communication skills or professionalism. So also putting themselves at medical legal risk. And now actually learning, so less sleep you had, the less you rated your kind of residency experience and overall learning, as well as sleep loss contributes to actually just being less motivated to learn, impairing actual kind of short and long-term learning, and those kind of higher order thinking skills that you need within medical education. So all those studies were coming out. We kind of put these resident duty hours in place and hope for the best, right? Bang, done. Easy solution. Obviously not. And some of it kind of is really interesting. That's why research sometimes is so interesting when you keep going. This is the roster study, randomized order safety trial evaluating resident fatigue schedules. So it was, again, from the Harvard group, it was a multi-center crossover clinical trial. It actually involved pediatric residents rotating through PICU, and residents were randomized to either work the normal or kind of classical extended duty duration shifts, which were 24 hours, or shorter, the intervention was 16-hour shifts again. Super well-funded study, even had kind of physician reviewers that were trained, sometimes following the residents around, or at least looking at kind of all their work for the day to try and pick up in real time any medical errors or near misses that might have happened. And the first, when they kind of looked at the first set of data they had, things were looking good, right? That they were working less work hours during the week, that residents were sleeping better, and actually they did kind of some more of those neurobehavioral performance testing with them, and those improved in the residents that were working 16-hour versus 24-hour shifts. And then, like everything in research, they kept going. And when they actually looked at the effect on patient safety, it was completely against their hypothesis, but serious medical errors in the intervention group, so those working shorter shifts, actually went up. And likely due to, I mean, if you have people working shorter shifts, you have less people around. So actually the workload, the number of patients per physician went up. And actually when they controlled for workload, there was no difference after all. And obviously the more shorter shifts mean more handovers and kind of decreased continuity of care. So if you're not teaching people how to hand over properly, there's a risk of kind of communication or kind of not handing things over that led to error. So they kind of concluded that excessive work hours degrade patient safety, but so too do excessive workloads and poor handoffs. So all these kind of sweeping changes that were made in the US and Europe did not result in kind of large decreases in medical error for kind of the things that we talked about. So like we probably knew if we thought about it, that duty hours are just one of the many factors that impact fatigue-related risk. And then when you actually look at the studies themselves, even linking resident fatigue or kind of healthcare fatigue and some of these fatigue consequences, they're not very well done or not kind of, great research rigor. Some of them are just kind of retrospective web-based studies, surveys that kind of are at risk of selection or recall bias. A lot of the stuff that we know, including that what we talked about with the kind of related to equivalent of alcohol or intoxication risk are sleep lab experiments. So they're not really validated against actual in vivo kind of medical tasks. Or there are these kind of subjective self-assessment surveys that don't often have validated tools. So really what complicates the matter further is I think inherently we all suspect that fatigue definitely has an impact in a risk to patient safety as well as practitioner well-being, but it's not solid. Again, the hard to do in vivo testing, relying on sleep lab experiments, and the outcomes as well are hard to exactly pin down and different between all the different studies. Not to mention that how do you tease out, how does fatigue contribute versus all sorts of other complex factors that go into both medical errors as well as kind of how one experiences their own wellness. And there's also this kind of research blind spot for longstanding cultural values that like why study it in the first place, given that we're so used to these conditions. And a second thing, when they kind of studied, and there's been lots of study on these RDH restrictions, especially in the States, was that when they surveyed residents, actually 2/3 weren't even compliant with the restrictions. Not that they didn't believe in them, but just usually continuity of patient care or education got in the way. So the Royal College, instead of prescribing a national duty hour restrictions or a limit across the country, they did some research and they did this large needs assessment with all sorts of stakeholders in postgraduate medical education. And they ended up releasing this report that came out with a set of principles and recommendations, really emphasizing the approach should be more on almost like a safety risk minimization in residency training programs, and that one size fits all is not going to work because we have so many different settings and even, not just locations, but different specialties, et cetera, that will all need then their own approach. So then the fatigue risk management project launched, and their first output was this fatigue risk management toolkit, which actually is available on residentfatigue.ca, and they put together this comprehensive toolkit. And this was around when our research project started to be launched too, is trying to how are we going to apply this toolkit and some of the principles in it to the medical education environment. And it goes into a whole bunch of background. It's meant kind of a non-prescriptive resource for, with some strategies for mitigating fatigue that you can kind of use in your own context. I don't know how many times I've looked at it now, but it is, doesn't exactly tell you how. So it's a lot of comprehensive research, but it probably needs a little bit more direction to it. And then they really doubled down, and the Royal College did, and they added it to the standards of accreditation. So you pretty much have to pay attention now to fatigue risk management. Right now, that's the expectation that fatigue risk management is included in residency program curriculum plans and safety policies, which I know a lot of people are scrambling to meet. Eventually, I was told by the manager of accreditation at the Royal College that it probably will be an expectation for people to also have a more fully developed fatigue risk management plan in their residency program. But that's kind of to come down the line. So really fatigue is inevitable when we're working in 24-hour environments, especially no matter what, if you're working overnight, you're going to be fatigued. And potential and likely risk to kind of patients and the providers themselves. And really all of us within medical education play a role in decreasing that risk. It's really kind of increasingly viewed in society as a safety hazard, and a lot of other industries that have kind of similar low thresholds for adverse outcomes, such as, think of aviation, manufacturing, transportation, et cetera, have really developed these robust fatigue risk management systems. And again, there's reason for there too, and they've all had kind of different incidences that have propelled them to do so. Just a couple of them here. The Exxon Valdez oil spill. I didn't realize all these things had an element of fatigue in them. I think third mate was actually on his 18th hour of service. There was kind of lax safety measures that were or complacency to safety in the begin with, and again happening kind of overnight. This realization that they were on the wrong navigational path happened a little bit too late. The Challenger space shuttle explosion as well. The people kind of, because they wanted to reach their launch window, I think they'd gotten 2 hours of sleep the night before, a lot of the managers. And I think some of them had been on, duty since 1 a.m. when they actually kind of launched there at 11 a.m. And unfortunately, it resulted in the explosion and the deaths of the astronauts. Chernobyl as well. They were kind of the workers. This was a little bit more of a reactor kind of issue, as well as the Challenger being the famous O-ring. And there's a great Netflix documentary. But at Chernobyl, they were on their 13th hour of shifts without breaks. And unfortunately, the Air India flight as well, where the entire flight, if you see there, happened during the pilot's kind of circadian lows. Actually, the pilot was asleep for 3 hours, and there was actually snoring heard in the cockpit voice recording, and woke up kind of 20 minutes before the crash and experienced what's called sleep inertia, where you kind of have that, that grogginess, that where am I, the lack of kind of perception, automatic behaviors, kind of that flawed logic and failure to grasp the severity. And one thing that kind of is common to all these different, tragedies is, I think as long as you're on autopilot, it's fine, but really fatigue interferes with that, problem solving, thinking outside the box and kind of doing something different, or realizing that something's wrong or something has not happened as it should.
I'm going to try and start off and keep your attention, and I'm going to make a couple of what I believe are quite controversial statements.
So this is Professor Drew Dawson. So he's who we work with on the project. He's Australian, obviously. He works at the Appleton Institute, which is a big sleep research institute in Australia. And he'll kind of frame things, is what I'm trying to say, in a much blunter Australian fashion.
Of fatigue management. And the first is that you can't eliminate fatigue. I'm going to say that again. You can't eliminate fatigue. And the reason for this is really simple. If you're working at 4 o'clock in the morning, it doesn't matter how much sleep you've had, you're still going to be fatigued. Not because you've been up for particularly long, but because your body clock is at the wrong point. You're in your window of circadian rhythm. So one of the things that we think is really important for organisations to understand is to change the narrative and the way that they talk about fatigue. Rather than saying if we comply with our rules of rostering, then fatigue won't be a problem, we actually think a far more useful way for organisations to think about this is to think about how can I work safely when I'm fatigued? And we think that's important for a couple of reasons. One, it acknowledges that fatigue is an inevitable consequence of shift work. It's an inevitable consequence that sometimes you'll be up with a sick kid, or you might be running late, or you may have had a bad night's sleep. You can't get rid of fatigue in the workplace. And what we think is that if you change the narrative around that, you'll lead to some very interesting conversations within your workplace. The second thing I'd like to talk about, and again, is I don't really care whether you're fatigued. You'll see lots of workplace policies and stuff that say to people, if you're fatigued, you need to notify your employer and you need to not work. Part of the problem with those rules is that everybody knows that they're stupid. When we're thinking about fatigue, the important thing for us to think about is the risk, not the actual fatigue. As I said, we can't eliminate fatigue, but what we can do is start to think about fatigue in an honest and realistic way, and think about some of the things that we can do to eliminate the risk associated with fatigue, rather than eliminating fatigue per se.
Perfect. Thanks, Drew, and for your Australian forwardness. So where does that leave us? So really talking more about fatigue, again, we're not going to eliminate it. We can decrease as much as possible, but really kind of in that more safety management system, risk management system. So when we talk about fatigue risk management, it's a set of ongoing prevention and mitigation practices, principles, and procedures that happen all throughout the clinical and academic work environment. And really it's designed to both kind of monitor as well as improve and manage the effects of fatigue and the risks to the patient population and the healthcare providers themselves. Professor Dawson comes at it and he has this kind of defenses in depth model, very similar to the Swiss cheese model we've seen, kind of preventing medical error. And really kind of that, level, with 5 levels. And that first level is really trying to, optimize schedules themselves. So you give people enough time to sleep, and then really preventing that fatigued individual from being in the workplace in the first place. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we know about, scheduling, et cetera, including how to do better with the circadian rhythm that we haven't really put into place yet. Second is kind of, if you are fatigued, if you end up at work and you are fatigued, how can we recognize that? And actually what sort of controls we put in place that so an error won't happen. Third one is, again, measuring them in the first place, and then kind of doing an incident analysis to figure out what can be improved. And really only those first 2 kind of predictive and proactive steps are within the individual's control, trying to get enough sleep and recognizing their own or their others' fatigue. And the rest is up to the system itself. So what's fun now is we get to go into a little bit more of the local context. This beautiful picture here. So here, for those not familiar with our pediatrics program, we're called a medium-sized program, although 44 is enough residents, as well as having other residents rotating from NOSM and Queens and electives, based mainly at an academic pediatric hospital, but also have rotations kind of local NICUs, as well as community, rural, and northern placements. We should really have a graduated call system, kind of 1 in 4, as per the payroll union guidelines, and then decreasing with the postgraduate years, 1 in 5, 1 in 6, et cetera. Although I don't think any resident will like me saying that right now, given the last couple of years and all the difficulties we have with coverage due to kind of COVID-related illnesses or leaves, and many, I think, continue to work the 1 in 4. So our project itself had kind of 3 phases. The first phase is just figuring out if our residents are fatigued and by how much, and really exploring their experience with fatigue. Then taking all those results, summarizing them, developing our own kind of what's really an FRMP, like a fatigue risk management plan, by kind of incorporating the input of a lot of key clinical and educational stakeholders that could actually help us put in place. Then implementing these plans and evaluating. And obviously, maybe even a phase 4, we're kind of disseminating them to other residency programs and both kind of locally and across the country. I'd say we're kind of at like phase 1 3/4 right now. And I'll talk about the kind of baseline data, which is really interesting, and really how we're going to put it together and do something about it. So this kind of baseline fatigue scan, again, seeing if residents, as some of our guiding research questions, are they fatigued? What are the consequences? There are factors that influence how much sleep they're doing, and are we doing anything right now, or are there things that we can do to manage the risk? So of the kind of 44 PEDS residents, 33 participated in the virtual focus groups, then 23 residents, a few kind of dropouts, went to complete this 14-day sleep work diary, where for 14 days straight, they got an email automated from REDCap, which made them reflect on their work and sleep hours, as well as what we'll talk about, their fatigue scores before and after their work shifts. So on average, our residents are around 28, 29. We kind of had a little bit more females than males, which is kind of consistent with pediatrics. And we did have a good proportion of both junior and senior residents in the focus groups and sleep diaries. And for analysis, we included a total of 308 sleep diaries, which had 174 work shifts, including 63 call shifts in it, which ended up being around 2,400 work hours. So this was a little bit more of a subjective, not quite standardized survey that we did at the beginning. Not many people think they're getting enough sleep or enough rest. One of the residents gave me this photo to include from her Apple Watch after a night on call. So definitely some issues with sleep or not getting sleep at all during her call shift. And quite a few, kind of 2/3, really described disturbed sleep as a large problem for their health. So from the sleep diaries, I'll skip right to kind of the risks. And there's these thresholds in research kind of that for cutoffs for really what would give you an increased likelihood of fatigue-related error or related impairment. That's based on a lot of previous research, including in sleep labs, and many are informed by Professor Dawson's kind of prior sleep-wake model. Your sleep history. So if you've had less than 5 hours in the last 24 hours or 12 hours in the last 48 hours, that would put you at an increased likelihood of experiencing fatigue. The longer you've been awake, like on a length of time spent awake, increased fatigue, as well as the time spent at work, time on task, kind of consecutive hours do give an increased fatigue risk. I talked about those fatigue scores, and the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale is actually a validated scale, like a self-assessment scale. It's validated or standardized against kind of EEGs as well as kind of standardized performance tests. And this kind of 8 to 9 score is really associated with a high risk of micro sleeps. Micro sleeps are kind of those like quick kind of like head nods, eyes closed sleep jerks where you kind of maybe lose consciousness for a few seconds, or just unaware or not responsive to a sensory kind of stimulus for a few seconds. And the thing is, many people actually aren't aware that they're happening, and that they just maybe think they've lost focus for a second, but actually kind of you're shown with the EEGs that you're asleep during that. So here are the results. And despite kind of the work shifts, obviously it makes sense the longer you're working, the tireder you get, but it has more of an influence on, I guess, getting in the way of the sleep you've had. So really the most evidence is behind your actual sleep. So in our data, 2% up to kind of all-inclusive 11% were kind of the shifts had an increased likelihood of having a fatigue-related error or impairment. And this, I thought actually, given that's a little bit more objective with their self-reported sleep data, subjectively, it kind of coincided. So residents were beginning the shifts. So these were before the shifts, their fatigue scores with that kind of high risk of micro sleeps, and obviously contributing to a fatigue error. So putting that into context, and this is what Professor Dawson always drives through, is that in our data set that residents, around 11% of their recorded work shifts, they were working with performance levels equivalent to being legally intoxicated, which is, an interesting way of putting it, but true. So then we had that kind of data. So it's looking like there is some fatigue risk present at our center. So we wanted to go a little bit more in depth of it. So we had a series around 7 focus groups, kind of 5 to 6 residents each, trying to kind of how their experience in their own residency with fatigue has played out. And kind of the 4 major themes came out. That was how they recognized fatigue, again, the factors that influence their sleep, consequences to their personal and professional lives, as well as strategies they used to minimize the risk. The interesting thing is that just kind of on resident reflection afterwards, it was pretty cute. They kind of said that just actually the experience of doing the focus groups and being asked about their fatigue was almost a therapeutic intervention in itself. So when we talk about recognizing fatigue, the most kind of common or frequent, I would say, reported effect was really this kind of emotional dysregulation, which is known and obviously talked about in the literature, but this is kind of the first time that's really been at the forefront of kind of the thing that they most kind of felt from fatigue. And here's some of the quotes, and I'll let residents or resident stand-ins read them for you.
It also really affects my emotional state. I was on my way home after a night of call where I hadn't slept, and I actually cried about whether or not I should buy a bagel from Tim Hortons. That was too much of a decision for me to make, and it was too overwhelming. It also really affects.
That's my favorite quote, because I can actually see it happening. So that's kind of just how they're feeling it. So when we talk about risk of fatigue, again, thinking about that Swiss cheese model and things that might contribute to the fatigue risk. This is maybe a resident stand-in.
A stat page, which the first 3 digits for 911, and it's the dead of night. I pick up the phone and put in the numbers on the pager. It cuts off and I get emergency services, and they're like, hello? What's your emergency? And I'm like, no, what's your emergency? Why did you call me? Then there's an overhead page and I have to go.
This one's kind of sad, but funny, but like in that kind of dark humor, funny way.
A stat.
And then again, we talked about these micro sleeps.
I had to tell the senior resident about this patient I had seen in the emerge, and it was 4 a.m. She was laying down on the couch. She was falling asleep. I woke her up. She's talking to me, and she fell asleep in the middle of her sentence, and it was literally just like, and then she woke up. She was like, where am I? Did I just fall asleep? I'm so sorry. She was so embarrassed. Such a rough thing to see. I guess we can smile about it, but that's pretty intense.
Again, that kind of macabre, funny, but dark humor way. So again, fatigue consequences, knowing that there can be of extreme nature. I think my audio didn't work for this one, but really, again, this kind of low educational motivation. I felt this quote was quite interesting, that my chronic fatigue manifest is not necessarily wanting to put myself outside of my comfort zone for learning. Asking questions takes a lot of energy, because not only is it thinking of the question, but also retaining what information you're being passed on. So I find in rotations where I'm more tired, I end up sitting more stagnant and pushing my boundaries. So it's really, and it was a frequent kind of theme brought up, is that not going out of your way, not seeking new opportunities, but just getting through things. It's not really using the full extent or getting the full kind of impact that their education could, or educational experiences could have.
Every day is a tryout for a resident, because you're being supervised every sentence you say. Every patient that you hand over is being judged and supervised and is going on your evaluation. It lends to the guilt I feel. I should be better. I should be nicer. I should do more, but you don't have anything left in the tank.
So again, that kind of, guilt of not getting enough out of your training experience. So on that happy note, now what? So again, we go back to fatigue risk management. And one of the things that kind of giving a little bit more hope to the discussion is that there's actually a lot of things that we're already doing. We just maybe don't realize it. So Dr. Dawson has another 1,000 cited article about fatigue proofing. So that's really, again, putting things in place, just expecting people, or if people are fatigued, what controls you put in place for to decrease the risk of having an error or leading to a fatigue-related incident. Think about all the things that we kind of do implicitly, but we really just need to kind of bring to the forefront and have a more formal process for instituting them and doing a little bit more explicitly. So in that toolkit, there are kind of some sample fatigue mitigation strategies that, again, some of these things that we're probably already doing. And there's, things to think about just both for yourself, kind of how residents, how they can keep themselves safe while working fatigued, and also how we can keep each other safe.
The night senior comes and will ask the juniors, what has your day been like today? If you had a crazy day, how tired are you? And prioritize people that are less tired to get the first admission or two, so that a person can relax or sleep. Or some people like to get their admission out of the way first off so that they can sleep after that. So having that conversation and working as a team that way, I found, has been beneficial.
It's really that kind of open communication and sharing of kind of fatigue. This is my last quote.
It's a lot of double and triple checking and really trusting whoever's on the other end of the line asking questions. If it's a nurse calling, I'll often make him or her repeat the story twice, and then I'll try to answer twice and make sure that makes sense to them. Or if I'm writing orders, I'll double check with someone beside me, or I'll quickly go and close the loop with the person who's receiving these orders. It's another brain, hopefully one that's more awake, but even just another sleepy brain is hopefully better than just the one.
I really like the two sleepy brains are probably better than one, and it's looking like John there might need some help with his x-ray, but that kind of double checking is, especially overnight and maybe in that kind of circadian low or high risk time is definitely something that really common that came up. So this is kind of maybe what we'd like to get to. A video from the PGY1 kind of online module for the symposia series that we put together, but I had to share one because I just love them.
Alex is learning how to manage their fatigue. They are preparing for their second block of junior night float. In anticipation of the first shift tonight, Alex slept in this morning and took a 2-hour nap this afternoon. They have packed 2 meals for overnight, as well as several quick grab snacks to add to the protein bars and nuts they keep in their locker. After completing a consult and reviewing the case around midnight, the senior resident suggests Alex take a break. Alex drinks a cup of coffee, goes to the call room, and sets their alarm for a 30-minute nap. 20 minutes into their nap, Alex gets woken up by a page. To counteract the effects of sleep inertia, they stand up and turn on the light before returning the page. They inform the ward nurse that they just woke up, who then makes sure to repeat her question twice to make sure it was heard and understood. In the morning, Alex provides handover to the incoming day shift and waits for their partner to pick them up from the hospital. Alex wears dark sunglasses on the way home to minimize sunlight exposure. When they get home, Alex eats a light breakfast, then goes to sleep in their dark, cool bedroom.
Great job, Alex.
Alex.
So now we're kind of on the home stretch. We're almost done here. So really, I guess, it's obviously a complex issue, but why have maybe things not moved forward as much or barriers to change? I guess specifically in the medical environment, opposed to, obviously we need airplane, aviation, kind of transportation, et cetera, but there's definitely an increased risk of not providing the service. So, sometimes that a tired doctor is really better than no doctor at all. So that's one of the kind of things that comes into the conversation, as we talked about really how complex medical errors and just, the resident's experience or our own experience with well-being is, and how do you capture the contribution or relative contribution of fatigue. And then medical culture, which Professor Dawson always tells me is he just kind of describes as the things you do without asking why, for culture. And there's this fatigue paradox, which when this group kind of did focus groups with a bunch of different doctors, nurses, residents, everyone was able to admit that fatigue is a very, it's everywhere, a problem in the clinical work environment, has lots of negative manifestations, but they weren't up until the point where it reached patient care or got to patient safety. There's a lot of different reasons for this, including kind of, just the culture, the experience that, you learn to get used to fatigue, which is actually not true. You just become less aware of how impaired you are. And kind of some of the blind spots being a little bit more, faith in safety nets, but also a little bit of a defense, because if you are fatigued, there's not that redundancy in our system that you can't say you're fatigued and go home, right? So it's almost a self-defense that it's hard for people to admit that they might be putting patient care or others at risk and not really have anything to do about it. So that's that kind of fatigue paradox. And really, and my last one. And again, also just from work in the residency expectations that sometimes, that getting that full sleep might be interrupted by other things.
There's a lot of other pressures outside of residency, outside of our hours in the hospital, like research and studying and feeling like you need to improve and constantly be studying. A lot of that pressure also prevents you from being able to go to bed and sleep and chill with your friends.
So what am I asking from everyone, or what's kind of the 3 points? So really, I'm hoping that we really need to get on the same page and convince you a little bit that fatigue is a kind of justifiable occupational risk in the medical education that really has potential implications to, patient safety as well as resident and workplace safety as well. These are kind of the 3 things that come right out of that fatigue toolkit, that fatigue risk really affects us all. Kind of putting some hope in there that there are some things that we're already doing that don't involve hiring a gazillion more people or huge amounts of money, but really just kind of I guess, formalizing the processes that probably do help and making it a little more kind of standard practice. And it's everyone's responsibility. And it's not just kind of a, doctor fix thyself, but everyone needs to be involved in this type of change. And here, even the CMA says it, that fatigue management is a competency that needs to be taught, modeled, mentored, and evaluated across the medical education continuum from medical student to practicing physician. And this is from kind of the Australian equivalent of the toolkit. And really, can we put our hand on our hearts and say we are currently doing everything reasonably practical to manage the risk related to fatigue? So there, I did it within, I didn't go too much over, but thank you very much for this time today. As well, I'll put up my thank you slide because there's so many people, including my little resident friend there, that contribute to all this work. And I'll leave it at that.
Wow, thank you so much, Amy. That was a great presentation. I think everything you've gone through is something that every one of us can relate to, right? I especially appreciated that you were talking about some practical things that we can do that don't involve hiring a gajillion more people and lots of resources, because that's not reality either. I really like the shift from trying to avoid fatigue to living with fatigue and really focusing on the risk. I think that's a really important shift for us because we're a 24/7 operation and we can't get around that. So those are important realities for us to face with.
No, I'm going to agree.
Yeah. I'm going to open it up to questions and comments from our participants. Maybe if you can take off your slides, sure, and we can see each other for the discussion. And I'll open it up to see if anybody has any comments or questions. There were some comments in the chat already.
Sarah, yeah, the 2 sleepy brains are better than 1. Maybe we need to get like t-shirts.
All right, Toby, up for you with the first question.
Thanks so much, Amy, for this amazing work, and also a huge shout out to, you see the participant numbers proportionally for survey and focus group are higher than would be expected in a random survey, which shows, I think, the amazing investment from our resident group and participating in both the focus groups and the survey while being fatigued. I guess my question, Amy, would be that obviously that sort of 10% that we have that number is unacceptable, and we need to work that down. And I think as an entire organization, we're thinking about in different ways now about redundancy in our system and backup and how we're going to plan for our new future that maybe is going to continue to have different rules about who can and can't come to work in a longer term way. Any thoughts in terms of building in that redundancy into our systems? Or, I think the other piece that really obviously speaks strongly to me is the impacts on learning. And I think, we're seeing issues with attendance at academic teaching, both on faculty and resident side. And I don't think that that is unrelated to the increased clinical demands related to the last 2 years and the impact that it does have on the quality of learning that people can receive when that fatigue is just omnipresent. So thoughts on either of those from the literature, where we need to take this from here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tobes. Yeah, I think that the most kind of exciting thing is that the field is wide open. Like this is really just the start of what we can do. So, anything that we do and we can really kind of be a leading center is new, and it's really trying to learn from it. Things that I can think of off the top of my head is that we know so much about sleep science and like how to properly schedule, especially shift work in a way that kind of works a little bit more with your circadian system, but we don't really implement that. So that's kind of one thing for sure, just not minimizing that being fatigued in the first place. And to be honest, we're not really capturing it. So in this total side project, and that's why I think, because there's so much opportunity that I keep getting pulled in different directions, and we're not actually really capturing it, or what is the true contribution, especially to patient safety and kind of safety incidents. So a side project, I'm working with the CHIO patient safety group, and we got a teeny little CPS grant to, first of all, do a retrospective review of our safety reporting system, because now that it has a big database, looking for fatigue is actually a check mark that you can put for a modifiable risk. Or we're also going to do some keyword searches in the descriptions, but I think there's like 7,000 plus instances we're going to look through. My hypothesis is that we're going to find probably next to none where actually fatigue itself was indicated, but hopefully we'll kind of jump off and get funding for a prospective study. And with kind of Stephanie Poirier and Dave Creary, they've already gone actually to COSC, and they're on board to actually making changes to our SRS system, which probably also would need to have a prospective study to better understand and how we're going to capture this kind of fatigue related risk. So I'm super happy. Just seems everyone's, I think, because we inherently realize that it is a risk that we've ignored, and there's huge opportunity just to make some real kind of important and probably hopefully with results and changes with results.
Great. Okay. Over to you, Mark Norris.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. Very stimulating. Lots to think about, obviously. I have probably about 100 questions, but most of those.
Start with number one.
I think there's a lot of, if I think about a decade ago, even though we weren't supposed to be coming to work, with sniffles or with, any infectious symptoms, there was a lot of people that would be wandering the halls with, sniffles and kind of a bit of a sore throat, but just convincing yourself that you're not sick enough to be home. Fatigue seems like we're in the early days of that. It's the, there's a lot of people that are wandering the halls that look profoundly exhausted. But if you ask them, or if you, even ask them to kind of, self-rate, if, depending on where that data is going and who's looking at that data, as one of the residents kind of said, it's, there's a lot of built-in bias, and I think there's certainly some stigma here. We are all at different stages in our life, and depending on what stage we're at, we're going to have different stressors inside the building and outside the building. The other reality is that, I really liked your point around the dysregulation, becoming emotionally dysregulated, but I would kind of expand that to say, it's not just emotional dysregulated. I think we become dysregulated across all kind of aspects of life, right? So we stop doing the things that we really like to do, the things that, allow us to cope in a healthy way, all of which kind of systematically just, contribute to that. My question is, My question is whether or not anyone in medicine, I know that we've looked at this, you know, across other corporate kind of areas, but in medicine, have there been any studies that looked at, you know, either regulating maybe the work hours in a week, or, you know, so I'm not suggesting that we're building out more staff, but we're just kind of reorganizing ourselves in such a way. And it speaks a little bit to what Toby said in terms of trying to be really efficient when we're here, but then actually increasing our ability to not be here. So, you know, comparing, you know, there's 6 people in a division, you know, are there different ways of doing this whereby you're still, everybody's getting the work done, but when people aren't kind of required, they're actually not required, and, you know, and sent away or on holiday or, you know, doing other things. Has there been any kind of real, you know, controlled studies that have looked at kind of, you know, any immediate or short-term outcomes in that regard?
I mean, the group we're working with from Professor Dawson in Australia, like they are quite a lot farther ahead of us in fatigue risk management. They've done a lot of really interesting studies, just like you said, kind of your realization, including like an app or like a survey that you have to take before work that puts you in a different risk category. And based on that, you have to wear a different colored lanyard, which so people will know that you're fatigued. And it's been shown that if people know how fatigued you are, they'll actually double or triple check your work. They've definitely done some issues like that. I don't know, I can't think of any that I've seen kind of the workload you're talking about, but definitely that was a big issue within some of the Harvard stuff. The main thing, we're kind of in that, I mean, they tried with the duty hours and then it was shown not to be as beneficial. And then after that was a kind of a bunch of research that was anti-duty hour, I guess. And there's, the problem is that the system, I guess the argument or the problem is so complex because a lot of people would say that, you know, that restricting duty hours means that you're not getting enough exposure. Then on the other side, how good is that exposure if you're that fatigued? So maybe you could actually, if you're better rested, you could need less, especially when we're talking about competency, like less kind of times or procedures. So I don't know about, I think it's, again, definitely an opportunity, but there's pretty much nothing out there.
Okay, Amy, we are at time and there's 2 more questions. I think this is a really important topic, so I'm gonna allow this to go on, but I'm gonna ask that the 2 that have questions are very brief and the responses are brief as well. So first to Stasha, then to Mark Zucker. Go ahead, Stasha. Is she still here? She may have had to leave. Okay, that was very brief then. Okay, last question then to Mark Zucker. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you and Mark brought forward about emotional dysregulation and that, and recognizing when people are fatigued, I was sort of thinking tangentially to the people we work with and the people we care for, and we recognizing when our families are fatigued. And we see that a lot in the hospital and how that impacts our ability to communicate with them and have effective relationships, and whether or not this can extend out to that area and thinking this parent is actually fatigued. They need to have a sleep before we talk to them about what's going on, particularly in that transition from admission to ward and can be up for 24, 48 hours. And recognizing that and that we're also probably not effectively communicating when we're tired, and being as compassionate as we can be, and then also recognize their ability to actually attend and to hear and regulate their emotions. And I think we see a huge amount of fatigue in them that affects the care they receive and their understanding of the care they're receiving. So just a reflection of an extension of this research.
And I think that half of it is just the recognition of being fatigued in the first place. And I mean, I think, you know, those little micey guys, everyone's gonna have a different experience. It's one of the reasons I just can't do shift work, right? And at least being able to recognize that. Also the fact that thinking about merge, like traumas would come in, I'd run the other way. But really kind of knowing yourself and your own fatigue experience, what fatigue looks like to you, and kind of checking yourself as well. But definitely, putting it out to other people too, and what your interactions are like with them and how they might change, and again, giving people the benefit of the doubt too, especially in stressful hospital situations, how fatigue might affect your communication. It's great. Thanks, Mark.
Hey, thank you. I agree. That's a really great point to bring up, Mark, because parents are equally fatigued and stressed about what's going on. So we have to think about all the people that we interact with and how fatigue affects them. Thank you so much, Amy. This was a really great presentation, and I really look forward to how you're going to help us to continue to help us to manage risk related to fatigue as we go forward.
It's a team effort for sure.
Team effort. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.